Hey guys, welcome to a new video. Today's topic is all about getting sharp images. And if you're just starting out in sports photography, this video is for you. If you've been doing this for a while, then it's likely that the things I'm going to be talking about are quite trivial. All right, so your first tip is all about shutter speed. So the amount of time you allow the camera sensor to be exposed to light. And we want that to be very, very short because we want to be able to freeze the action. So I would say a good starting point would be 1,000 of a second. Now, obviously this takes into account a lot of different factors, such as, for example, the ambient light that you have, what type of sport you're photographing, etc. But that would be a good starting point, and then you need to adjust. Maybe you need to go faster. Sometimes you can get away with a little bit slower shutter speed. So 1,000 of a second would be a good starting point. If you're shooting children, for example, you might go a little bit slower because they're not as fast. If you're shooting really fast sports like hurling, baseball, etc., then you probably need a faster shutter speed to be able to completely freeze the action.
Right, let's look at some shutter speed examples. Like I said, 1,000 of a second as a starting point, which is the shutter speed I used for this image. Clearly not enough. If you look at the foot that's about to strike the ball, there's some motion blur right there. I was working with very poor lighting conditions. You can see the ISO is already at 6,400, but you know what? I'd rather have a little bit more noise, so higher ISO, but have the picture completely frozen. So I should have raised my shutter speed a little bit more to freeze the action completely. Is the picture still usable? Yes, of course it is, but it could be better. Let's look at a different example. The strike of a slitter, 1,600 shutter speed, still some motion blur. You can see the hands and the hurley are, not completely sharp. So there's room for improvement there. So remember, adapt your shutter speed to the sport that you're photographing. Same sport, obviously not striking the ball, running still very, very, very fast. And in this example, I'm at 3,200 and it's completely sharp. There's not a hint of motion blur anywhere, not in the hair, nowhere. It's absolutely spot on. So adapt once again, the shutter speed to the sport that you're photographing. And if you have to have a little bit of noise, that's okay, because noise, you can work around it slightly. Motion blur, you cannot.
So that was the first tip. Remember, fast shutter speeds to be able to freeze the action and get sharp images. Next up, the focusing mode should be in servo. If you're using Canon mirrorless, if you're using a Canon DSLR, the older ones will be called AI servo, I believe. What that does, basically, it forces the camera to constantly hunt for focus, which makes sense, right? If we're tracking fast moving subjects, we want to be able to keep up with them and always be in focus. If you're using, for example, one shot, that will not do the trick. So remember, always use AI servo. If you want to get a little bit more advanced and you handle the focusing quite well, you can learn a technique called back button focus. I've made a video about this in the past. It will not make you take sharper images, but it will give you an additional control of the focus. Basically, what you're doing is you're removing the focusing from the shutter button, from the half press, and you're assigning it to a button in the back. That's why it's called back button focus. So the shutter will just be metering and taking the shot. When you fully press, it takes the shot, and the focusing will be on the back. So you're basically only telling the camera when to focus and not constantly. If you want to keep constant focus, then you fully press the back button. But anyway, that's probably a little bit too advanced. If you want to learn a little bit more about it, click on the link to see the video about that technique. Next up is the focusing points that you're using. If you're using a mirrorless camera like the R6 Mark II, the R5, the R3, the R1, etc., they have very advanced focusing modes. So it really doesn't matter which point you pick because it'll track not only humans, it'll track the eye as well. But if you're using an older DSLR, you probably don't have those focusing modes. So I would suggest you use a single point focus. Pick the middle one because it's the most precise one, and aim for the chest. Why the chest? Because it's the biggest area of an athlete and it's easier to track as you're tracking a moving subject. Obviously, we want the head to be in focus, but if the chest is in focus, then the head will likely be in focus as well. So remember, single point focus, aim to the chest, and you should be good. One thing you should not do, regardless if you're using a DSLR or mirrorless, is allow the camera to pick the point of focus. The camera does not know what you're trying to focus on. Don't let it make that call for you. You should be the one saying, this is the area, or this is the point I want you to focus on. Next up, let's talk about aperture. So how wide does the lens open? So the wider it opens, the smaller the number. This is a little bit confusing to get your head around if you're just starting out, but let's talk about fast glass. It's very common in sports photography. So 7200 f2.8, for example, the lens opens quite a lot. It lets a lot of light in, and it just makes the background completely fade away, right? So that's why it's very used in sports photography, a lot of light, and it makes the background fade away and the subject pop. However, when that happens, you're playing the focus, so the area of the images that are in focus is very shallow. So let's pretend this rectangular is the whole image, and you focused in the middle, f2.8. Maybe this is how much is in focus, and everything else starts fading away out of focus more and more and more. So if you miss focus when you're using a wide aperture, you're gonna ruin an image. Yes, it's amazing to have a subject focused at f2.8 and everything else just fades away, but you have less room for error. Remember, a small number means a wide aperture. A big number, say f11, means a smaller opening. So f11, for example, it will have pretty much everything in focus. In sports photography, for the most part, we want to be able to use a wide aperture, but keep in mind that comes with some disadvantages because the margin of error is very, very slim. Let me show you some examples in Lightroom.
Now let's look at one where I failed completely. So in this case, I think you can even see it right away zoomed out, but if we zoom in, you can see the slitter, which is the ball, is focused, the player is not. So this picture for me is trash. I would not use it at all. The main subject, the player, obviously is out of focus, so it would be no good for me. So be very careful when using low f-stop, so a wide aperture. Be wary that your plane of focus is going to be very shallow. If you miss, there's very little room for error.
Another tip for getting sharp images is understanding, knowing the sport. And you might think, what does that have to do with this? Well, simply put, if you know the sport, you know when to anticipate the action. You are ready before a key moment of the game happens. If you're photographing a sport you don't know the rules, you have no idea what's going on. Maybe you're shooting it and say, oh, what's happening right now is cool, let me photograph that. So you pick up your camera, you start to focus, maybe your camera takes a little bit to hunt focus, and finally, when you get it, it's too late. So if you know the sport, you're already focusing, you're already taking pictures, so by the time the key moment happens, you're just already set, you're already taking pictures. That could be very crucial because in sports photography, key moments can happen in a split second. And if you're not expecting it because you don't know the game, then you're gonna miss it. Another tip for getting sharp images, if you're using a longer lens, so I would say from the 7200 and above, so 300mm, 400mm, etc., use a monopod, okay? These things can get very heavy, especially if you have the grip. With the 7200, it's okay to pick it up and take a few shots, but for a full game, it's gonna get heavy, and if you're heavy, you're bound to not be very stable. If you get a monopod, it just gives you that peace of mind. You can just sit down, it'll be stable, you won't shake basically, so it'll take good pictures, and it's just better overall. Another tip for getting sharp images is how you hold your camera. That might seem a little bit basic, but I see some people holding it like this with the left hand on the zoom ring. It almost looks like an airplane. That's not stable. Just get your arms tucked into your chest and you'll see it's a lot better. If you're using a lens that has image stabilization and you're shooting at 1,000 of a second or above, you can turn it off because it's also not gonna do anything for you. Then if you have all the settings correct, the images look good on the computer, but they don't when you're looking through the viewfinder. Check this little wheel here, which is the diopter. That will basically focus what you see on the viewfinder, not what the camera sees, but what you see on the viewfinder. So focus on something you know is stationary, so it's not moving. Focus on it, and then adjust that wheel to have, it's almost like you're putting on some glasses to make it really focus. Again, that's not what the camera is capturing, it's what is showing on the viewfinder. So for people who use glasses, that's very important to make sure that you have that correctly set for you. And last but not least, if you have all the settings correct, you're doing everything right, but you still see some weird sharpness on your images, they're just not tack sharp. Maybe you have some dust or hair on your camera lens or your camera sensor. Don't use your fingers ever. Don't use any objects there to remove dust or hairs. Use a rocket blower. These accessories just blow air basically, so you can use it to take out some hairs or dust from your sensor or your lens, but never ever use your fingers or objects to remove that, because you might damage the camera sensor or the lens. For the front element of the lens, you can use some lens cloth, but again, remember, never use your hands or objects to clear any dust, hair, etc. That's it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, click that thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you aren't already. Till next time, take it easy, guys. Stay safe.